Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Mark New. I'm Director of the ACDI, the African Climate and Development Initiative at the University of Cape Town. The ACDI is the vehicle for the university's strategic focus on climate and sustainable development issues. This is one of several strategic areas where the university has a desire to contribute towards solutions to critical 21st century problems, and particularly problems that are facing South Africa and the wider region. So the role of the ACDI is to encourage collaborative research on complex issues around climate research that have a definite and strong impact on society. I'm not going to make any more or do any more selling of the ACDI because we're here for a very different reason, and that's to be an audience to an open lecture. Open lectures are opportunities for members of the university and the wider public to hear thought leaders from both within and without academia to talk about issues that are of wide public interest. Now, today's lecture is in partnership with the Department of Water Affairs, and it forms part of the National Water Week. National Water Week is a series of events that are happening this week in the lead up to World Water Day this Friday. Now, I think it's really good that we're having the talk this evening because most of us will probably be on holiday on Friday, making use of the water facilities that the Western Cape offers us. Now, this lecture, and particularly the delicious drinks and food that are waiting for you after the lecture, have been provided through sponsorship, which we're very grateful for, and that's both the Breda Overberg Catchment Management Agency, and the Catchment Management Agency is actually one of only two functioning catchment management agencies in South Africa, and a real example of the practical implementation and successful implementation of many of the principles in the Water Act as it was first conceived. Our other sponsor is Oricon South Africa, one of certainly the Western Cape region's premier environmental and engineering firms who do a lot of really interesting and progressive work in the water domain. So before we get to the main topic of our talk, I'd like to invite Mr. Phakamani Buthelezi, who's Chief Executive Officer of the Overberg Catchment Management Agency, the Breda Overberg Catchment Management Agency, just to make a few opening remarks. And if you like, these are opening remarks from the perspective of somebody working at the coalface of water management, managing a complex water resource system that covers several river catchments and many competing demands for water. So without further ado, Mr. Buthelezi.
Thank you very much, Professor. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, and I'm sure there are no enemies, so I don't need to acknowledge our enemies in water. There are none. I think this is very, very interesting that in the year 2013, we're having this event here at the University of Cape Town, one of our very few best universities in the world, I think. And then we are having this occasion today, which coincides with the United Nations Declaration. We are all aware that the United Nations has declared this year, 2013, as an international year of cooperation. I mean, in simple terms, it simply says all of us who are passionate about water issues, who are driven by the understanding that this compound would not be there forever, we need to put our resources together. It is very interesting that it's as if the United Nations was studying our functions as BOCMA, because as the Breda Overberg Catchment Management Agency, we have long ago before this year was declared as the year of cooperation, we have long ago decided to say for us to manage these water resources, we need to cooperate with all the institutions, with everybody, to ensure that water becomes a graphic topic for every water user in our country. Hence, when we established, the first thing that we had to do is to ensure that all our water users in our geographical area are involved in the management of water resources. But what is this catchment management agency? A catchment management agency under the National Water Act is a water management institution set up which works under the Department of Water Affairs and is like any other public entity. It is governed by the board that is appointed by the minister. It accounts to the minister, and it has a functional relationship with the Department of Water Affairs. In other words, we were established to ensure that we are closer to the people, because I'm sure everyone will agree that in order to manage water resources, you need to involve the people on the ground. Hence, if we want to manage our water successfully, we need to adopt a water-based participatory management approach, which eventually will ensure that every water user is taking part in the management of this resource. I think some of us are not aware that our area, which is, I think is about 116 kilometers away from Cape Town, is functionally linked to the economy of Cape Town, in a sense that the water that you are using here in Cape Town, I think more than 22% of that water, it comes from our area. If Cape Town uses 22% of our water or more, it means UCT also is using our water. Hence, this cooperation comes at the right time to remind you that you can switch on and off that water at any time if you don't behave. I think the essence of water management institutions like the CMA is to say, we as South Africa, we are a water scarce country. If we are a water scarce country, we need to adopt an active participatory approach where all the water users, irrespective of the sectors that they're coming from, are getting involved in issues such as water quality. Water quality is for everybody. It's not only for the farmers who exports their grapes, but all of us, we are affected by water quality. And it's not only about surface water, we are also interested in groundwater. Hence, as the BOGMA, we have decided to enter into strategic partnership with the universities. And I'm sure one of those strategic universities will involve in the University of Cape Town, where we come up with practical solutions to practical problems that we are facing. We always look up to the universities as centers of excellence that continuously keep on giving us innovations and creativity. Hence, we entered into a memorandum of agreement with the University of the Western Cape and the Cape Peninsula University of Technology to try to find common solutions to our common problems, besides building our own research capacity. And I'm sure such a university like University of Cape Town wouldn't want to be left out. So the door is still open for the University of Cape Town to work with such a dynamic organizations like the Bread Overpay Catchment Management Agency. Those who are in the know, they don't use the long term, they simply say the beloved BOGMA to make things much easier. So in short, what I'm saying, we are taking this initiative of cooperating with everybody to advance a citizen-based management approach where our stakeholders on the ground are involved in the management of water resources and where we partner with the institutions, and hence we found it appropriate today to partner with the University of Cape Town, with other partners, ARECON, and the Department of Water Affairs. One thing I should have said earlier on is to tender an apology from the Chief Director of Western Cape Regional Office, Mr. Rashid Khan. He really wanted to be here, but due to other reasons, he is unable to attend. And I understand the minister, or I'm not sure whether he's still coming, but he is no longer coming due to other unforeseen situations. Being an agent of the department, I need to pass on those apologies. I think those apologies are well welcome. Let's continue to enjoy the topic. Water is our life, water is the future. Without water, our future is a challenge. Let's support the Breda Overpay Catchment Management Agency. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Buthelezi. Right, so on to tonight's speaker. From a climate change perspective, water is one of the critical lenses through which climate and development issues play out in the real world, as Mr. Buthelezi has described. And the reasons for this are many, but we all know that water supports many aspects of development, from supplying basic human rights to water and sanitation, through to supporting just about every aspect of the economy, from agriculture through to mining, and through to, if you like, the softer aspects of the economy, such as tourism. Yet at the same time, fresh water availability is ultimately a function of climate. How much water flows through our soils and into our rivers and into our groundwater systems depends on how much it rains and how much of that rain is evaporated back into the atmosphere. And the balance between those two is essentially the water that we have available to support both our economy, our people, and our ecosystems. So if one reads the popular literature on water, and indeed a lot of the academic literature, one's left with an impression that South Africa is really heading for a water crisis. It's getting squeezed between a rock and a hard place. The rock being the pressure that continued social and economic development places on the water resource through increased water demand, and the hard place being the local impacts of a global problem. That's climate change, and most of the projections for climate change suggest a more arid future for most of the country. So it's against this backdrop of water being squeezed on both the supply and the demand side that I'm pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, is Dr. Desigan Naidu. He's the CEO of the Water Research Commission. Now, the Water Research Commission is a hidden benefactor that not many people know about of much of the research into water issues that happen in South Africa. I don't know if Desigan's going to explain this, but every time you turn on a tap, a certain fraction of what you pay goes to the Water Research Commission to support research on water issues in South Africa through a levy on water use. Desigan is by training a medical scientist, but he jumped ship from medicine to join the South African government in 1996 as part of the National Research and Technology Foresight Team before moving into a number of different government departments, including water affairs and environment. And then he ended up as Deputy Director General in the Department of Science and Technology. He then left government to serve as Director of Research and Innovation at the University of Pretoria. And then in 2011, he sort of moved into that nebulous border area between universities and research and public policy to become CEO of the Water Research Commission. So we really have a speaker here who's moved back and forth between policy and research, understands the interplay between policy and research, and who's now responsible for the strategic direction of research on water issues in South Africa. So I think we can't find a better speaker, really, to address the question, South Africa's water challenges, a cause for despair, as the popular literature would tend to make us think, or an opportunity for leapfrogging. So without any further delay, please welcome our speaker tonight, Dr. Desigan Naidu. You know how to drive this.
I will indeed. Thank you very much, Mark. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you so much for being here. And my sincere thanks to Mark and Kevin and Max for the opportunity that they gave me to come and talk to you on this, a very important day for South Africa in National Water Week, but also a rather important day for Cape Town, because today there were This is the third of the events today. The other two were officiated by the Minister with the launch of a special stamp collection around Water Week, and then non-revenue water and discussing the ins and outs of non-revenue water, which I'm going to talk about in my presentation a little bit later. I can only assume that since we're being hosted by the Climate Change Pro Vice Chancellor of UCT, that the car in the picture must be hybrid driven. If it's not, I think we're going to be in a spot of bother. So what I'm going to do today is to share some thoughts with you around this very intriguing concept. Because not too long ago, as part of the public hearings into the National Water Resources Strategy, the Mail and Guardian held a series of critical dialogues. And a word that was often used in these dialogues was the word crisis. And it has a particular kind of impact. It is quite paralytic. And so I'm going to examine a little bit of this today to see whether or not we're organizing for ourselves to have the right paradigm of thinking around this and what the role of science and technology can be. The global water challenge is one that we know well. The global water challenge is not new. This is not a 21st century problem. The world was in crisis around water in 1 AD. It was in crisis with water in 5000 BC. It was in crisis with water in 100,000 BC. The reason why it's particularly stark now is because the information flow around the world is rampant. So we're not looking at a new phenomenon. We're not looking at a new crisis. We're talking about the perpetuation of a difficulty that has been there in various shapes and forms for a long period of time. But what has made it so stark in the current discussion are some of the following things. The first of those things is a recognition outside our community of practice as to the nature of the problem. The World Economic Forum in 2012 declared as the #1 business risk in the world the assurance of supply of water. This focused the mind. When the economists start talking about it, the world usually thinks that this must be important. Of course, we can challenge that. The second is that there's a visible diminishing of water quality in our river systems worldwide. And there are many things that are being done to respond to this challenge, and we'll return to this later. The third is the huge growth demand in all sectors. And because of that, we have huge competition between the various sectors around the availability of a resource and its allocation. Now, Pakamani presented a very nice picture of Bokma. I'm glad he did. But one of Bokma's challenges, and one of the challenges of the CMAs in this country, and the equivalent agencies all around the world, is managing the allocation, because all uses are beneficial. And this is an extremely difficult process. We have, in the 21st century, demonstrated some very impossible things. One of those things we have demonstrated is that water flows uphill towards Gauteng in the direction of money. And this has brought a whole new phenomenon in the water challenge that we face around the world. This is not only true for South Africa, but in most developing countries, this has become a new phenomenon. And the realization that continuously that the net loser is the environment, is Mother Nature, is becoming more and more stark. In a much closer space, this is how I visualize the South African problem tree around water. The first is the population dynamic. And this is something that causes great offense in many discussions, but it's a reality, is that we have a much larger number of people relying on a diminishing reasonable quality resource. This is just a reality of the world. The second part of that is that we also have at the same time fairly rapid economic growth in much of the developing world, which means a fantastic change of lifestyle. Unfortunately, we have pegged success and economic development with excess. So we're moving from modest water lifestyles to excessive water lifestyles very rapidly. The third part of that is that in much of the world where growth is happening, that growth happens to be water intensive. It's around new mining activity. It's around new oil exploration, more extractive industries. And where there are new industrial formations is about water-intensive industrial processes. And this together might be forming what can be considered the 21st century's version of the Malthusian challenge. And then there's the confounding factor, Mark called it the hard place, of climate change. And climate change is a reality in our part of the world. Some parts of the world are still having this as a discussion. In South Africa, in Southern Africa, this is not a discussion, this is a reality. And it has expressed itself in some very fundamental ways. We have a new nutritional security crisis. We are visibly seeing from month to month, from season to season, a change in the disease burdens in our parts of the world. We are seeing in our part of the world a new phenomenon rising in the social sphere, this phenomenon of climate change refugees. There are folk in South Africa, particularly from a little bit north of us, that claim quite justifiably to be climate change refugees. The climate change has had such disastrous impact in their parts of the world, with droughts and floods and other extreme events, that their livelihoods have disappeared, and they have actually become some of the world's first climate change refugees. So this is the problem tree that we're looking at. And yes, it is a complicated one, because in the South African environment, we are familiar with these pictures. We are familiar with eutrophied dams, and that happens to be one of the oldest ones in this country, and it's the 100-year conundrum, the Hartbeespoort system. We have witnessed service delivery protests, and we've done WRC studies, and the WRC studies on the causes of the service delivery protests have put three things on the top of the list: water, electricity, housing. The three primal factors, common cause in all of the areas where there have been protests. In a country that currently is the 29th largest economy in the world, we're supposed to be wealthy. We still have those pictures on the right-hand side. The pictures of people not having access to water. We have aging infrastructure, we have flooded agricultural lands, and we have severe damage from things like flash floods. We cannot ignore the fact that the word crisis may well be the right kind of fit for what we're looking at. So the question is, how do we interpret this crisis? I did something wrong. Now, crisis is an interesting word. In the languages most of us use, crisis means only one thing. But if we go further east from ourselves, crisis isn't only one thing. And my favorite interpretation of crisis, and this is quite an old phenomenon that became quite popular in the Nixon years, is the Mandarin word for crisis. The word is weiji. And the interesting thing about weiji is that it isn't one word. Because what weiji actually is wei and ji. The wei part says that when you're looking at a crisis, you are definitely looking at a time of danger. Now, we're reasonably convinced here, and for the past couple of years, I've been having an intensive discussion that we are, in fact, in a point of danger as far as water is concerned in the world. The part we're not looking at acutely enough is the G. Because all crises represent a time of opportunity. Now, one of the more interesting public policy philosophers of our time is our Minister of Finance, Pravin Gordhan. And one of his favorite sayings, and he said this in several fora quite repeatedly, is you should never waste a good crisis. And I think this is the challenge that we should give ourselves. That here is a point of hardship, here is a point of challenge, it is real. What can we do to use that as a launch platform to get to a much better place? And I think when we manage to do this, we start dealing with the paralysis effect. We get away from the paralysis. We potentiate ourselves to do something more. So there's the question. Is this our weiji moment? If it is true, then we must design and implement a weiji response. And of course, we're continuing with great philosophers. I think we should start with this one. Now, some people in the room are as old as I am, so you'll know who this is. For the younger folk, I'm sure you can Google it. But one of the great philosophers of our time, Bob Marley, uttered these words in a song called Redemption Songs. With Max, I'm sure you were singing in the 80s and 90s. We, ourselves, we have to emancipate ourselves from the mental slavery, because within us is the ability to free our mind. And what are we looking at? We have a global landscape where there are several countries in the world that have far more water availability per capita than we do, that do a lot worse than we do. And there are a couple of countries in the world that are, for all intents and purposes, absolutely arid, that do a whole lot better than we do. What is the difference? Well, one of the things that we need to examine is, what are the features of these water management leaders in the world? What are the features associated with the likes of Singapore, with many of the Japanese cities, with some of the Scandinavian countries, that make them really profound and successful in this space? Well, it really amounts to four things. The first of those things is this highly informed water decision making, highly informed. And that usually means two things. One is, what is the center of the development discussion, and a core criteria in the development decision. Now, this doesn't really happen in South Africa. In South Africa, there is an economic feasibility study done, there's a political decision made, and there's an instruction that the water must arrive from somewhere. Well, it generally doesn't work. And if it does work, it only works for a short time. The second is infrastructure and continuous innovation. I mean, Singapore managed to organize itself into a single catchment. It's a large funnel that sits on an island that manages to secure all of its water. And it does it on the back of very, very smart infrastructure in a combined, joined-up effect. But it's not satisfied with that. There's continuous innovation all of the time. The other factor is, you have to have large pools of very skilled talent. Where you can't grow them where you are, as you could do in Japan, you buy them from where they currently exist, like you do in Dubai or the United Arab Emirates in general. Because you need to make your system work, and we need to concentrate on what this means for us. But the most profound thing is the issue of water use behaviors. We are an incredibly wasteful society. I don't know how many of you do this, but I know it gets really cold in Cape Town in the winter. But if you're one of those people who lets the shower run for 2 or 3 minutes to get hot before you get in, you're not only wasting the water that's running down the drain in front of your eyes, but you're wasting all of the water that needs to generate that electricity that you're also wasting while you're doing this activity. And it's all about the power of one, because the impact that you make, positively or negatively, impacts the entire system. So keeping up with the philosophers and returning to this message, the message is about responsibility of the individual, and this is from Michael Jackson, who talked about starting with the man in the mirror. We do have to start with ourselves, and we do have to change our ways, and we have to make the change. But let's move on to what these opportunities might be, because they're not so obvious sometimes. The first of the opportunities is that we have available to us a series of very wicked problems. Now, this morning we had a 3-hour session on this with several people, and some of the folk are in the room, where we talked about this on the back of a study recently completed by the WRC on non-revenue water in the country. The figures are stark. In the municipalities in this country, the average non-revenue water, that means the water you cannot account for from the billing, is 37%. It's a gigantic amount. The study also said that 27% of the water is actually lost in the system. It's real waste, it's real leakage. And the complexity of the problem cannot be denied. It's the financial management issues, it's the poor infrastructure issues, it's the bad water behavior issues, it's a weak skills base, it's a weak engineering base, and it provides this wonderful complexity that defines what a wagey response should respond to. And this becomes one of those opportunities for us, because if we can organize the right sequence of solutions around this and crack the non-revenue water problem, we will not only be cracking this problem for South Africa, because the 37%, as it happens, is not far away from the global average of 36.6%. This is a global problem. And there's an opportunity here for global leadership. It's about how we want to tackle this issue. And there are more opportunities. I mean, we've all read the newspapers with great alarm and watched the inserts on the television of acid mine drainage. Acid mine water is a cruel problem in this country. A lot of it in Gauteng, but a lot of it elsewhere in the country as well. And this comes primarily on the back of 200 years of very bad mining practices in this country. I mean, the mining regulations in their current form have only been in existence in the past 40 years or so. But it does several things. One, it focuses the mind. It focused the mind so much that the Treasury put aside some 600 million rands to deal with this crisis in one aquifer in Gauteng, in the Eastern Basin. But what else does it offer? One of the biggest problems in the world, as an emerging problem everywhere in the world, is salinity. Because as we continuously use the resource and put the stuff back into the river systems, we're organizing for the system to rapidly get more and more saline. So we're going to have a global brine problem in the very near future. The ability to deal with acid mine water gives you the technological platform and know-how on how to deal with salinity and brines. And here again, there's an opportunity for global leadership for South Africa. Because we already have developed some of the leading science platforms in the world to deal with this issue, and some of it very close to you. One of the groups that works on this and is producing an incredible amount of knowledge in this domain is the group at UWC, and the other one is the one at UCT. And the UCT group, on the back of a WRC project again, has developed something called eutectic freeze crystallization as a methodology to deal with acid mine water. But it's much more sophisticated than that. It's about organizing the freezing of the water in certain conditions so that you can smartly, at each phase, pull out different minerals. It becomes a harvesting process. Now, if we continue in this line, what we're going to organize for ourselves is not only to deal with the acid mine problem and convert these polluted waters into a viable resource for the country, we have the opportunity for technological leadership in the world on how the world deals with salinity. And in fact, South Africa, as part of something called the Global Water Research Coalition, is in fact leading this initiative. Another part of what we need to look at is the issue of sustainable livelihoods. I think that one of the things that has happened in the world in the last couple of years, on the back of the most recent financial crisis, among various other things causing us to disbelieve economists intensely and really examine the science around some of the business decisions people make. I mean, Cyprus, with 1 million people, sneezed and the world caught a cold. It's an amazing phenomenon. This probably is the most pronounced visualization of the chaos effect in the world. But that aside, what is organized for us to starkly absorb is the conventional paradigms around building economies may not be the right way to do it. That organizing for people to have more and more job creation opportunities might not be the sustainable way to go. That increasingly, those parts of the world that are growing most rapidly are relying on sustainable livelihoods rather than jobs. So we need non-classical growth pathways. So in the South African environment, in the middle of this water crisis, when we're looking at what is available to us, one of the things we should be looking at is how we use our science and technology solutions to create this economic diversification. And here I'm highlighting another one of the WRC projects. I must highlight that the WRC does not do any of the projects on its own. It does all of these projects in partnership with various other institutions. But this WRC project, organized for very successfully working out the science and then doing a series of demonstration exercises on the viability of inland aquaculture in this country, solving a livelihood problem and simultaneously talking to a sustainable nutritional security paradigm and general upliftment of communities. And here again are opportunities in the middle of this crisis to find new ways out of the science and technology that we do to provide new and innovative solutions for the world as a whole. One of the biggest conundrums we have as a country, and one of the biggest conundrums in the world, is dealing with wastewater. So much so that South Africa's biggest public research agency, the CSIR, now has as a cornerstone of one of its 5 flagship programs, one of the program being water, the cornerstone of that program is wastewater treatment. Because the huge issue around wastewater is the issue around energy. It's an issue around infrastructure investment. And increasingly, we need smarter and smarter and smarter solutions around this. And we will get there. Because together with the international partners, and this is the year of international water cooperation, so this is relevant, we're all developing systems around this. New decentralized systems, new technologies, moving to energy neutral solutions around wastewater management, and eventually we'll probably crack this. But that eventually may not be soon. That eventually might be 20 years from now, it might be 30 years from now, it might be even longer. In the interim, people have to live. And there's the other point of innovation that is available. What the world needs now are point-of-use systems. If we could organize ourselves to develop the kinds of technology where Mrs. Makwanazi, Johnny DeLanga, the chair of the portfolio committee, illustrates all these stories with Mrs. Makwanazi, so I'll borrow that from him. If Mrs. Makwanazi has the ability to draw from a resource close to her, a river or a well, the water, and pass it through a point-of-use system that organizes it to be in a safe enough quality for use, we would have changed the fates of billions of people around the world. Now, there's a very wealthy chap in the United States called Patel that has issued something called the Patel Challenge to the world. And this competition is still running, and there are 2 South African innovations on point of use that are currently in the running for the final prize. But this is what we need to be doing. But here's an opportunity for very real solutions, not only for our country, but for the world as a whole. So I hope what I'm being able to illustrate to you is that within the context of this crisis rises a series of opportunities, which, if we seize, will organize for us to be in a much more prosperous place than we currently are. It will solve some of the problems that we're facing in the water dimension in South Africa, and it will create economic opportunity because South Africa can become a net exporter of new knowledge and technology to the rest of the world. And this is a fantastic place to be, because the countries that have come from where we currently are and have managed to do this, the likes of Singapore, the likes of Republic of Korea, have become leaders in the world in innovation and economic growth. And this is exactly where we would want to be. Now, a core part of the point of use story is nanotechnology. Now, one of the fastest rising disciplines in the South African environment in the science and technology domain has been nanotechnology. And this has come on the back of very good policy from the Department of Science and Technology. And policy is good, but when the policy is backed up by something like 900 million rands in new funding, it's even better. And on the back of that, we have now created in this country a very reasonable cadre of nanotechnology practitioners and researchers to help us to move this forward. The opportunity tree includes other things as well. I spoke about the wastewater solutions. There's the claim for one plant in the world at least that claims to be energy neutral completely. We'll see where we get to with that. But the other thing that we need to be looking at are off-grid solutions for water and energy. Because, you know, we have a grid mentality in South Africa, that the first stop on everything has to be conventional wisdom. Well, most of the time, the conventional wisdom is wrong, that we need to be in a better place. Now, one of the experiments that we did together with the University of KwaZulu-Natal, in a small village called Okombe in the Drakensberg, and it's all right if you don't know where that is. The Okombe part, you should know where the Drakensberg is. There was a community that didn't have power. And they approached various people, and we organized and responded with a project to use biodigesters to provide the power in that community. And they were a pastoral community that they could use the cow dung for this purpose. The problem was, where do you get the water from? And there was no possibility of extension of services from anywhere else. This is really in a remote area. And so we put into that place a water harvesting solution to provide the water for the digesters. The net result has been that this community now has enough power for all its non-cooking needs, to the point where it sells the power to a neighboring village, and it has satisfied all of its water needs. Now, we're taking the same model to other areas, to other situations, including the urban environment, because off-grid solutions around basic resources, particularly water and energy, is what's going to help us to crack the bigger problem around climate change eventually. And then alongside this, we look at very novel mechanisms of how these things can happen. And Akash Ganga is something that we're dying to replicate in South Africa. It's something that works in Gujarat, in India, currently. And what it is a village model for water harvesting as opposed to a personal household model for water harvesting. And it's on the back of some incredible smarts. Some of the features include that whatever you collect into your own rainwater tank, you can use whatever quota you need, and you can sell the rest to the village cistern at a price. You can collect a price for it. The second part of this incredible project, which was run almost completely by private sector partners and some scientists at MIT, was to try and get a contribution from the local authorities. And the local government said, we're very poor people, we don't really have anything. And these guys said, well, you do have one thing, you have space. If you can give us the space, we can build a big roof on that and have a big collecting surface for the water. And the municipality said, of course you can have it. Then the smart guys at at MIT helped to organize for the roofing material to be affordable enough so that you could have a large collecting surface. They collect the water out of all of this, and there are now 42 such villages functioning in Gujarat state that are now self-sustained around the water. Then they went one step further and said, it's very hot in Gujarat, and the sun dries up everything. So they're now renting out the land under the roof to local farmers to grow various kinds of produce. Now, those are the kinds of solutions that I think we can explore, that we can enhance technologically and would have fundamental changes to many people in this country. The last point I want to emphasize is something that actually is a sore point in the international discussion. South Africa, you will know, is a co-recipient of the Nobel Prize, being part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, because South Africa has contributed to some of the best science, best climate change science in the world. The UNFCCC, however, continues with its obsession around mitigation. Now, mitigating for the long term is not a bad thing to do. It's an important thing to do. But if you're sitting in a part of the world where the current predictions are that you're not going to have a 4-degree rise in temperature, but maybe double that, you have to worry about what happens next week and next month and the month after that. We need adaptation solutions, as most of the developing world does. And here is the other opportunity. And one of the things that the WRC will be doing next week is launching the Climate Change Water Atlas, together with the Ministry of Science and Technology, to start this road around developing we need the mapping, this is why we need the atlas, and then we're going to start working out the technological platforms we can use around dealing with the water issues associated as part of adaptation solutions to climate change. And this may be one of the biggest opportunities that we have yet. So why am I optimistic about all of this? Well, one of the reasons to be optimistic is that South Africa does very well in the science and technology domain as far as water is concerned. And this very small, this very modest water science community is actually highly productive. Now, the global average for South Africa as a contribution to global literature, as a percentage of papers, and the work here was done with the ISI index, and it's quite similar on Scopus, is that South Africa overall produces about 0.5% of the global literature, which is kind of right for its size. In the water domain, it's at 1.69%. It's more than 3 times the national average. At one time in its past, water sciences in South Africa actually contributed close to 3%. It talks to a very strong platform for water sciences in the country. Small platform, but a strong platform. Secondly, the South African ranking overall for all disciplines is 33rd in the world, which again most would argue is pretty good for a country like South Africa. In the water domain, it's number 19 in the world. It's in the top 20. More than that, we have a higher than average conversion of research to patents compared to any other science discipline in this country. So on the one hand, we're saying that we have a fairly strong starter base for a science platform. The second thing that we're saying is that we have an ability to convert that knowledge into real solutions for the real economy to make a difference. This is a good reason to be optimistic. The second part of the reason for being optimistic is that while the first set of stats are indeed associated with aging white males, as the general problem is in the science and technology world in South Africa, one of the reasons why we should be optimistic is that we're actively building new cadres. One of those markers is that in the last round of projects the WRC approved for funding, 47% of the research leaders were either black or women. So they come from the PDI group, and a lot of them were young. So we're starting to build this new cadre. So I hope you're starting to share some of this optimism, because this sounds like a good space. The further optimism comes from a very interactive national water resource strategy process. Now, some of you were with the minister this morning, and she was very candid about where we are. And one of the things that's happening on this NWRS is it's signaling a turning point. You know, after 14 years of writing a water law that the world claims is the best water law it has ever seen, so much so that Professor Kader Asmal received the Stockholm Water Prize for it, we've come into a point where we finally may have the strategy that will implement that water law, because it hasn't been done for 14 years. So this NWRS2 is indeed a point where we should take heart from. The second part of this is that the level of public awareness in the South African environment is very stark, hugely stark. I mean, the service delivery protests are hugely damaging on the one hand. On the other hand, it's giving you the signal of two important things. One is the awareness of people of the issues, and two, there's a democratic maturity being expressed here, where people are saying that as individuals, as groups, we will self-organize to express ourselves. We do not need to have the aid of general political movements. Now that's a signal. It says that people are ready to move to a different place, and that must be a positive point. We can and we must channel this energy and this awareness from the point of protest and outcry around non-delivery into energy that can collectively develop solutions and move those solutions into the real space. And the bottom line is the power of one. All of this starts with you and I, because individually we can all make a difference. Now, we can't do this for many things. Many things require much more complicated solutions than we can do. But the water domain and part of its ability to connect us to the various parts of human systems is that we can all make a difference. We can make a difference to ourselves. We can make a difference to the people immediately around us. And we can make a difference to entire systems. And so my final quote today comes from Mahatma Gandhi, because that is the message. Because if we collectively and individually become the change that we want to see, then that change will definitely be realized. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Desigan. Desigan is not only a brilliant speaker, but he's very good at timekeeping. So we have plenty of opportunity for questions, and what I'm going to do is leave Desigan to take questions. So if you could just scan the audience and try and pick a diverse set of potential questions to choose from. And after about 10 or 15 minutes, we'll call it to a close, and then we can head outside for refreshments and continue any unfinished conversations at that stage. So over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. And thanks a lot, Isken, for your presentation. I just want to find out, I mean, there are a number of issues or challenges facing the country that you have alluded to, one of them being water. The other issue The other issue is job creation or poverty alleviation. And you have indicated in your presentation that we have to now start thinking of different forms of job creation instead of going the normal or the known route. We should start looking at entrepreneurship and the like. In the projects that the Water Research Council has supported, are there any projects that can be implemented on the ground that will look at job creation, creating new entrepreneurs, as well as looking at the issues both of energy as well as provision of water?
Oh, thanks very much, Ngaba Ngapai. You alluded on your presentation, you spoke, if you were to advise a minister and the minister asked you a direct question, how would you go about in trying to advise her in terms of bringing solutions on the conundrums that you touched, you talked about earlier, because you talked of the conundrums that are facing South Africa pertaining to water resources. So how would you go about in trying to unpack those things? Thanks.
Hi, Mao Amis from Pegasus Strategy and Development. Right here.
Hi.
Well, you acknowledge that, you know, businesses are increasingly viewing water as a business risk. And you cited what the World Economic Forum study that they have produced. My question is, you know, and businesses are moving out very fast to develop innovative measures to mitigate that risk. But unfortunately, the public sector policy arena is not actually keeping up to speed. Because at the end of the day, water poses a business risk. But if public policy does not keep up to pace with innovation, you'll be left behind. So my question perhaps is, how do you bridge that gap between policy and innovation to ensure that these tools that are very innovative are taken up as fast as they are generated? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. In polite public audiences, people don't ask hard questions. But this is a university, so I guess... Well, let's start with the first one. Mohammed, the issue around whether or not you can use cleaned, treated, polluted waters as a water resource is no longer a debate. You know, it was for a while in Malashleni, but it wasn't around technological issues, it wasn't around scientific issues, it wasn't around quality issues. It was about some people being stuck in a very specific governance paradigm. Now, one of the lessons that we get from other parts of the world that do very well are places that organize for a strategy to make this a major part of their water supply. Now, one example that you will know, because you'd have studied this, is Singapore and the 4 taps of Singapore. Well, one of the 4 taps of Singapore is remediation of waters, remediation of polluted waters. And it has very interesting repercussions in the system. I mean, there are some downsides to all of this, of course. Because one of the big problems with treating polluted waters is what to do with the concentrated polluted water that you have eventually. And I'm glad we have smart engineers like yourself that are working on that conundrum. But using the water for different uses have to go through certain safety standards, but they must happen. And the signal has come from the National Department that this is indeed the case. So there's no policy obstacle to this at all. And increasingly people should be thinking in this domain. The second question was around entrepreneurship. This is a new area of work, but maybe the most novel example is entrepreneurship in the sanitation domain. And this is a project that we did together with the government of Ireland in the Eastern Cape, where we needed to introduce sanitation solutions to schools that had none at all. And instead of doing the usual sweep of bringing in expertise from somewhere and running through the system, the first phase of the project that we did with Irish was that we built the capacity of training local entrepreneurs to be the practitioners around this. We also contracted with the Eastern Cape government that if we did this first pilot of 400 schools, that they would in fact do the rest of the province. And this has worked hugely successfully. So much so that this has in fact won an international award in the International Water Association. And there are many more of these examples that are bubbling through in the portfolio that we're working on. Around the water energy nexus, it tends to be a little bit more complicated. But you know, like every complication, it needs a scientific solution, so we're working with that. I'll come back to communicating with the minister in a moment, because that deserves some thought. On the issue around the business sector and public policy and the bridge, you know, this has to go hand in hand. Firstly, public policy should never catch up. In the better system, public policy leads. So something has to be done around the public policy to make that happen. But you know, the most successful mechanisms around this are in fact the partnership mechanisms. Now, in the context of the World Economic Forum, there is a water resources group that has been developed. Its most functional national chapter currently happens to be South Africa. It's very new. It's all of 8 or so months old. And what it's organizing to do is to provide public support, and the WRC provides research support, and the private sector players offer the demonstration mechanisms in their plants, and we're moving this whole thing forward in a very reasonable kind of way. Now, the business sector is not coy about why they're doing this. The fact that it's part of the public good is a good bonus. But the real reason these companies are in this space, and we're talking about the Sasols and the SABs, and the Nestles and so forth, is that their global markets demands a demonstration of resource efficiency. That is the boardroom discussion. This is why some of the folk are able to go as far as they do. But around the bridge is around those kinds of partnerships. But those partnerships must be well supported. You've got to give the business sector a reason why they need to co-invest in this. And we seem to be finding some of the elements around that. Around how one has this conversation with the minister, the answer is passionately, actually. And she's very receptive to that. The more difficult conundrum is how to convert all of that passion and that meeting of minds into the kind of implementation plan that makes sense. I mean, to give you an example, the water conservation, the non-revenue water study says that the current losses amount to about 7 billion rands a year. It's not small cash. Now, if one went to Treasury and said, look, to get a serious dent here, we need to have about 2 billion rands a year to have the intervention. And your cost-benefit ratio is pretty good. It's about organizing to make that argument stick in a space where there are competing challenges for the same pot of money to make that kind of thing work. I think that's where it gets unstuck. But one of the things that we are investing in as a scientific community, and this has been a discussion in something called Cohort, which is something the Minister of Science and Technology convened. It's the CEOs of all of the public research institutions, is to put together the science plan around the National Development Plan. You know, what kind of science and technology is needed to support the successful implementation of the NDP? It's not a trivial exercise, but I think if we crack it, then we're providing with the kind of support that is required to make this happen. Thank you. Is there another round? Yeah, this is bad. My hearing is bad, my sight is bad.
My name is Bokang Mawa, and I'm a fourth-year medical student. I was wondering, you know, because medicine and environmental health, well, obviously, environmental health is included in medicine, particularly water sanitation, affects a lot of the off-grid areas, particularly in rural areas, and the incidence of disease because of water contamination could be up to 10% in infants. From your perspective, how feasible do you think it is to provide tailored water management systems like the one that you mentioned, the place near the Drakensberg Mountains, within these particular communities? How feasible is it to make these water management systems tailored to that particular community? Or do you think it's easier if we look for a more universal but cost-effective and low-maintenance system that could tailor for a larger communities that we could replicate within these particular off-grid areas? This is obviously looking in the context of South Africa and the resources available to do this.
Hi, I'm going to take the liberty of asking two quick questions. And the first is, you mentioned in one of your slides that to engineer the wagey response, we need to embrace complexity. And I just wanted to get an idea from you, exactly what does that mean in practice? And then the other question I have is, you speak a lot about science, and I'm just wondering whether that relates to the hard sciences or to the social sciences as well, and where the role of interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research comes into.
Just a quick question. Just talking about the aspect of waste, the large amount of wasted water in the country and how we want to reduce that. What is your stance on the idea of fracking and the nature of that, and how, I know it's very controversial, but how much water is wasted with that and the idea of it?
Don't you think that putting the emphasis on climate adaptation rather than mitigation plays into the hands of business and industry that were largely culpable of creating the climate change problem in the first place, and who can now use a fast deteriorating situation as a lucrative marketplace for high-tech solutions?
Well, on that last point, that's going to be the topic of Mark's public lecture in the next little while. It's an important one to deliberate, actually. I can start with that. The reality is that adaptation technologies are both a dire need in our part of the world, but also an opportunity for South African industry to lead. If it gets construed as organizing to let people off the hook, we would in fact be in a difficult space. But the reality that we know is that if the developing world doesn't ride this horse, the developed world is not going to assist with this issue. And there's some very complex factors involved with that. The fracking I should leave as the last point before you go to your cocktail. On the issue of environmental health and pollution and sanitation, you know, one of the things that has to be starkly visible to us is that we have very illogical solutions and outdated solutions around some of the things that we do. I mean, waterborne sewage as a standard of choice is Victorian. It's more than 200 years old. In fact, the most celebrated thing about waterborne sewage is the invention of the S-bend that separates you from the sewage. We need to move on. We need to organize ourselves into the space of not just exploring new solutions, because many of them have been explored, but actually implementing new solutions in a viable kind of way that takes us away from that space. And the biggest impact factor on disease is going to be minimizing waterborne sanitation. And then alongside that, I mean, there are going to be the various environmental health issues that go along with it. Now, one of the places where some of that solutions might come in is that South Africa, and the WRC specifically, has been asked and funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to run a very large initiative in Southern Africa, which we're starting this year, around examining exactly this point. Now, there was a big conference in South Africa last year. It was called FSM2, Fecal Sludge Management number 2, which the media, yes, and all the T-shirts were dark brown. It's unbelievable. The media called it the toilet conference, where there was an intrinsic examination of this. And there are some very viable solutions that people have been working around all over the world, but cannot get past the demonstrative phase. Not on the back of bad science, the science is good. It's on the back of cultural factors and social factors, et cetera, et cetera. And we do have to crack this. Because the reality is, in sub-Saharan Africa, far too many infants die from waterborne diseases that are completely avoidable. I mean, you'd have caught the news this morning that there's now a cholera outbreak in Limpopo. This is completely unacceptable. So we need to have a bit more smart science, yes, much more demonstration and demonstrative action with leaders in communities around making these solutions stick. On the issue of social science and hard sciences, I thought it was the other way around. I thought the natural sciences and engineers coming from the easier ones, and the real hard sciences with the social sciences. I don't make a differentiation, actually. We're talking about science as a whole. And the issue of transdisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity as fundamental parts of the solution are becoming increasingly stark to us. Now, one of the places you can see it locally, right here, is on the climate change research agenda right here at the University of Cape Town. And then the National Coalition Around Access, where we're visibly demonstrating how these elements come together. One of the things that we want to roll out in the next little while, possibly in South African schools, are point-of-use solutions for cleaning up water at the local level. The science has been done, the technology has been worked out. The nut that we're cracking now is how to get people to use it. And there's some very complex behavioral science that goes along with that. So this is something that is well supported, but more than well supported, we need to get practical about it. And another thing that we're doing, there's a WRC project that is currently underway defining the social science research agenda for the water sector. And hopefully when that is completed, and the target date is July, is we will start rolling out some of that as well, because we need to develop CADE as a people. Complexity in practice. Well, complexity in practice is all around you. Think about any successful solution that you see around you, and it is a result of the ability of the people who dealt with that to deal with complexity. There are no linear solutions that are sustainable anymore. I'm not sure if they ever were. That we have to have the ability to visualize the problem in all of its dimensions and carry the problem simultaneously and develop the complex solution that needs to meet the complex problem. The ability to deal with that complexity really defines whether or not we're going to be successful. And maybe complexity is too complex a word. Because it's a lot simpler than that. It's actually doing what human beings naturally do, and we naturally carry all of these dimensions with us. We are taught generally in academia to separate that into the different factors and to adopt a more inductive approach to things. We need to de-learn that in some kind of way and bring people together. Interestingly enough, in all of the studies that have been done around collaboration and networking, the people who seem to be least successful around it are social scientists. You know, the most collaborative happen to be physicists. I'm not sure why that is. Maybe because physicists don't have any other friends except other physicists. But I think there's something to be examined there. And then finally, on the issue of fracking, well, here's my view on fracking. And I'm on a protected platform. I'm speaking at a university, so I can say it as I see it. I don't think that South Africa is in fact going to have a discussion about whether or not there's going to be fracking. I don't think that South Africa has the luxury of that discussion. I think it's become even more stark now with the rand-dollar exchange. And if you come from where I come from, you're now paying 13 bucks a litre for petrol. Lots of people are walking in Joburg nowadays. So the opportunity to have energy security, and in particular oil and gas, is hugely attractive in the system. So what can we do? What we can do is to organize for the fracking activity in South Africa to be a global best practice. And it is possible. I mean, we're having a WRC dialogue around this in April, where we're bringing the various players together, and Shell has already agreed to participate in this, to examine exactly this. You know, where are we going with this? What are the issues that we need to engage with? How are we going to mitigate against the harmful impacts? What are the possibilities that are going to be around this? And I think this is where we're going to be going. Is it a practice that, if it's not done at all, will leave the country better off than it currently is? I'm also not sure about that, actually. You know, because there's an opportunity here for an economic contribution that is very real in a very impoverished part of the country. Is it possible to do this in a way that has a minimum effect on the environment? Yes, it is. It hasn't been done anywhere yet, but the possibility must exist. And this is what we're going to push people to do. Because one of the things that has happened is that an exploration license phase has been opened up. And the regulators have retained the right on what the decision phase will look like. And with the EIAs and those folk who come from that world, if you have your record of decision written in exactly the right way, you can possibly achieve this. But the more science that gets into this, and the more dialogue that happens around this, and the more pressure that comes to bear around it, is what is going to make this the kind of thing that we don't regret, as opposed to what almost everybody who's indulged in fracking is doing all over the world. Okay. So thank you very much for your questions, and thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Desigan. So the path to refreshments is out to the right and up one level onto, I think it's called level 3. But if you hear just follow the sound of the clink of glasses and you should find the right place to go. So we look forward to further conversation up there. Thank you very much.